Hello, my History 495 students. This is your Professor Donald Earl Collins. This is the first day of the course, so welcome, 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 welcome. Yeah, we're here. We're a small class for my UMGC standards of 6 students. I assume that some of you already know each other because you've actually been through the history, and some of you might not because you might have been in and out of school over the years, but it's okay. That's what the introductions for week 1 are for, so please do those as part of the first week. I'll put up my own introduction at some point, probably Friday, to give you guys a chance to get to know each other before I start imposing myself on you. So here we are. What are we doing? The course says it's senior thesis in history course, and I guess on some level it is, but I'm gonna tell you a few things that might not quite fit the way the course has been taught over the years by the person who's been teaching it for the most part. I'm Jeffrey Glasgow, who specializes in history of masculinity in the Western world, particularly around maritime sailors and other things. I mean, that's basically what his dissertation was about. That's what he does for his PhD, post PhD, professorial research as a historian and a scholar. So I do not have that kind of approach. My approach to being a historian and being a writer, for that matter, is quite different from Dr. Glasgow. So I'll tell you about that a little bit as I go through what we're doing in this course and where I sit with all this stuff. So bear with me. This is probably going to be about 15, 17-minute video. I might do one other one as you get closer to handing in your first draft of your senior thesis, but I want to start with there. The course is basically designed so that you go through step by step, sort of like baking a cake and constructing a 5,000 or so um, word senior thesis. I can tell you for a fact that someone who has taught um, history majors, some of whom have worked on readings and research papers and theses, and master's and PhD students over the years between University of Pittsburgh, Carnegie Mellon University, Duquesne University College of Education, GW School of Education and Human Development, UDC, Howard University, here at UMGC, and over the last now 3.5 years at American University. That's among other places. That a senior thesis is quite a bit longer than 5,000 words. To put it in some perspective, my first research paper that was based primarily on primary research was 25, 26 pages long. I wrote that for my sophomore year in a history course for a history research course for majors, where you would do your first major research paper that was based primarily on primary research. I wrote it comparing the anti-apartheid movement and the civil rights movement and youth within both movements. It was not a great paper. It wasn't at all. You do your first research paper. I don't care how smart you are at 19 or how well you write at 19 and so on. If you don't have a lot of guidance, you're going to make mistakes, right? Theoretical mistakes, mistakes in analysis, mistakes in, the questions that you ask, so on and so forth. So that's my first experience doing that. That was 25, 26 pages, and I really didn't know what I was doing. I got an A minus in the class, A minus on the paper, etc., etc. It was admittedly way too broad a topic, so that's the other thing that I'm trying to communicate in terms of life lessons. And that was in 1989. So, to explain the fact that I have these gray hairs too. So, the second one, which was actually for a graduate course, I took my junior year on comparative slavery, where I looked at the the advent of British-style slavery in what is now South Africa at the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th centuries. And there I really did use primary records. I was looking at British parliamentary records. I was looking at colonial South African records from different periods and how slavery transformed over time. And eventually they got rid of slavery. sometime in the late 1840s, I think. Yeah, 1845, 1848, something like that. Um, they were among the last of the colonies to really drop any system of slavery. It wasn't a big thing, but they still took the basics of what we would call American slavery or British American slavery and applied it in South Africa for nearly a century, off and on, various groups, Zulu, Xhosa, etc., etc. So that one was 35 pages. And it could have been much longer, um, but it was that to give you some sense. That was nearly basically about a 9,000, 10,000 word essay to give you some sense of, what we're talking about. Senior theses can be John F. Kennedy's senior thesis on why England slept, which he turned into a book, by the way, which is 140 pages long. They typically can run from a minimum of probably about 30, really 35, 45 pages, all the way up to about 150 pages. So you're not getting the full senior thesis um, experience here. You're getting a partial senior thesis experience in terms of how traditional universities do this. That's not to say that what you're doing is easy. It's easier, but it's not easy. I'm just trying to give you a sense of what is being asked of you here. Um, and so, to put it another way, the other part of this is that generally speaking, when you do a senior undergraduate thesis, you have a senior undergraduate thesis advisor, one person, one on one, working with you step by step, checking in on your progress, asking you if you've got the right sources, asking you if you made the right analysis of those sources. Does the historiography, what does the historiography say about this topic? What are you saying that's different in some fundamentally minutia kind of granular way between the historiography or the literature review for your topic and what you are trying to say through your paper or through your thesis with this topic? That's different. That part of it is fundamentally the same. The length, how much primary research you're really going to do, um, how detailed you're going to get into all of this. That's what's different. And the fact that none of you are working with me one-on-one. There's 6 of you in the class. So that's the different experience than just working with a faculty advisor one-on-one. One of the other collegiate faculty members at UMGC has something in week 1, I think, about if you want to contact another faculty member within the program to help you, work on a one-on-one basis if you have a question or an issue, that you can go through her to contact one of those people. I have no problems with you guys doing that. You want to go work with someone else because you think they have more expertise in medieval Europe or in weaponry or whatever, fine. That's perfectly fine with me. My main concern really, besides you getting your work done, is plagiarism, making sure that you're not plagiarizing other people, that you're making an argument that where you essentially interrogate the historiography and literature and say, no, these people have not looked at this from this perspective. They've concentrated too much on white guys, or they've concentrated too much on um, rich people, or people who, or a perspective that says that's pro X or pro Y. Not a political perspective per se, but a perspective that does lend itself potentially to public policy and political debates, right? Those kinds of things. Those are the kinds of things you punch holes in the historiography in order to make your larger point, and you use the primary data for doing so. Now, the truth of the matter is, if I break down what you're actually doing in terms of this senior thesis, or what I would call a readings paper where you do a historiographical analysis, and then you're using some primary research way someone within a senior thesis, but you're not really going all the way there. 5,000 words is roughly 15 to 20 pages, right? You can go a little bit longer. Obviously, some of you probably will go longer than 20 pages, but if it's 5,000 words minimum, that's 15 to 20 pages. And so you take your introduction, your thesis, and topic statement. You take your historiography and literature review and some analysis of that. You're already at between 8 and 12 pages, right? So the primary research part and your conclusion based on that is only about 33 to 40% of the 5,000 words that you're writing. You can go longer, of course, but I'm just telling you that's what it looks like. And so there's some primary research involved, but it's not a lot. And I'm not expecting you to do that much over the next 6 to 8 weeks. Quite frankly, senior theses are supposed to be 2 full semesters worth of work. You're doing some of that work over 2 semesters between History 309 and History 495, but you're not doing, it's not, it, put another way, it's not as intense as it could be. So there's that truth around that. So, and I don't want you stressing out because it's not all it can be. I'm just trying to give you some sense of what the expectations for the course are and what my expectations are within that. And so my expectations are that you go through all the steps, right? But if there are weeks where you really can only do one response, there are only 6 people in this class. If there's only one person you respond to and you only end up doing one response through that week, do not feel obligated to necessarily do a second one, particularly for weeks 2, 5, 6, and of course, 2, 5, and 6, those weeks where you have to hand in something substantial, your proposal, your historiographical essay, your first draft of your senior theses. Those are weeks in particular where if you really only have time to do one response to your classmate, I'm not taking points off. I'm just letting you know right now. I know what the syllabus says. I know what Jeffrey Glasgow's expectations are. I know where my expectations are different from his in terms of doing this work. But in terms of the discussion, at least one cogent response. You have other. This is your main job is to get this thesis done. I want you to get that done and spend as much time as you can getting done as possible. So that means to me, some weeks, if you can only get one response in instead of 2, I'm just going to mark it as if you did 2. I mean, as if you did 2 responses instead of 1. Just letting you know that. If you need extensions, I'm willing to grant as many extensions as I can, but this course has some constraints, and I'm obligated to them. So you need to get your first draft done, however, crappy it looks by the end of week 6. You just need to get it done. Historiography, same thing. You just need to get it done. Those are things you just need to get done, right? And so I don't want you to get too bogged down and constantly requesting extensions, because at a certain point, this is an 8-week course. You have to get certain things done by a certain time, right? And so there's that. Anything else that I can think of in terms of my expectations? Those are the main ones. Those are the things that I think are important for you to hear. Now, a little bit about me in terms of what I do for a living versus some of the other people. This is where I do, there are some things that you're just going to hear, and you're going to be like, oh, that's different, right? But I am still a trained historian. I have a PhD in history from Carnegie Mellon University that I earned and officially finished in November of 1996. I officially graduated in May of 1997, so I've been done for a little bit more than 24 years, going on 25. So I was very young when I got mine. I got my degree a few weeks before my 27th birthday, so that gives you some math to do. This is my doctoral thesis right here, this big old 505-page thesis, printed in New School Century book. Even if you printed it out in Times Roman, it would be about 450 pages. No, between 450 and 480. There are a lot of words in here. My dissertation is titled "A Substance of Things Hoped For," which is a quote from the Bible, by the way. Multiculturalism, Desegregation, Identity, African American, Washington, D.C., 1930 to 1960. So I look at the origins of what I consider multiculturalist activity in D.C. public schools, in among African American elites, particularly the black intelligentsia, in and around Washington, D.C. at Howard University and other places. And the ideas of trying to make a curriculum more inclusive, those sorts of things. It's not critical race theory. For those of you who've heard the term critical race theory, trust me, it's not. I knew who Derek Bell was. I've certainly read critical race theory. I use it in my writings now, but back in the 1990s, it was still relatively new, and it was mostly constrained around understanding the law in terms of how systemic racism is literally embedded in American law, and all the in laws and customs and all the various ways in which it is. It's not just race. It's not just African American history. It's not just inclusion. For those of you who get confused about such things, right? And so I say that to give you both a sense of my background, but also a sense of understanding that there are all kinds of radical approaches to different things. And just because you take a theoretical approach or don't take a theoretical approach does not mean that the theoretical approach is a bad approach or a terrible approach. I've had students in the 289 class, which I'm assuming all of you had to take at some point, who've complained about Marxist theory and saying that Marxist theory makes people socialist and Marxist and so on. So it's literally an approach. It's an approach developed by Marx and Marxist, right? But it's not an approach that you have to be a Marxist to appreciate the understanding of materialism, how materialism in a theoretical sense can create all kinds of inequality, particularly in a capitalist system, which shouldn't be that hard to realize. But anyway, just giving you some examples. And so, I've written everything from scholarly articles for Radical Society, the Journal of Hispanic Higher Education, for History of Education Quarterly, for Teachers College Record, because most of my work in terms of scholarship has been the nexus between education foundation, social and historical foundations of education, and U.S./African American history. So that's really most of my scholarly research. But in terms of just general research, general writing, because I'm a writer too, I've also written articles for places as far flung as Al Jazeera English, The Guardian U.S., The Washington Post, Huffington Post, The Atlantic, NBC News Think, looking at African American identity and American identity more broadly in the context of education, in the context of critical race theory, in the context of a whole host of other issues, just popular culture, et cetera, taking what I've learned as a historian and as an educator and applying it in a broader, more, easily accessible way for people who don't have PhDs and aren't working on their graduate senior thesis. So there's that. So that just gives you some idea of who I am and what I do. But the main thing I want you to come away with this course, Glasgow wants you to come away with something that you can publish in, Phi Beta Kappa or Phi, whatever, I forget what it is that historians have or the scholar community has in terms of short publications. Most undergraduate theses aren't really publishable unto themselves. You would have to do more revisions in order to be publishable, to be perfectly honest. But that doesn't mean you can't take some of what you learned and publish it as an op-ed somewhere, or publish it as a feature article with the Smithsonian or with Scientific American or something along those lines. So I don't want you to think just about, I have to have this published or presented at a conference, because I know that's what weeks 6, 7, and 8 kind of deal with, in addition to you getting it done, thinking about publication, thinking about doing conferences, thinking about doing other things. You can do those things, but those aren't the only things you're limited to in terms of doing this work, right? Being a historian, being an educator in general, being a writer, right? You can do other things besides think about trying to reach 15 other people who might appreciate your work, as opposed to 100, maybe 100,000 people who might have a better understanding of some aspect of history because of your work. That's kind of the things that I want you to think about in terms of as you get closer to finishing this thing. But the main thing you need to do is keep in mind that we all have different approaches to this. And because we have different approaches to doing this work, it also means that your approach does not have to perfectly align with everything that's in the discussions in terms of the course itself, right? Meaning that I don't expect you to write like a historian, like an academically trained historian, with sentences that start with indeed and therefore and thus and all that other stuff. It's okay to have simpler sentences. It's not okay to not cite your sources. It's not okay to make an argument that is clearly political and ad hominem type of argument, where you're basically using straw men to make a larger ideological argument, that something that you're aligned and in tune with, as opposed to something that's supposed to be more fact-based, more evidence-based, more, if anything, theory in the practice, but definitely some theory behind it. Can't just be spouting off. So those are things that I completely agree with Jeffrey Glasgow, and I'm probably even more insistent on than he would be. So anyway, that's where I am with the course, and that's where I want us to start. So welcome again, and I'll promise to keep these videos to a minimum.